Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 157th edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And the reason why I stress Frank and Stan is that when you follow this up and you get the sort of words printed along the bottom of your screen, it comes up as Frankenstein. So but it's not Frankenstein, it's Frank and Stan chat. And those of you watching on video will notice that we have a guest, Jill Anson. Hello, Jill.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, and we'll come to Jill in a minute, but we'll go to Stan. Stan, you've got about half an hour or so before you head to North Wales.
I have, yeah.
The sun's out, it's a warm day.
Yeah, I'm coming back almost immediately. I'm not there for very long.
Oh dear.
But yeah, it's the weather's a bit thunderstorms at some point later.
Yeah, today looks okay though. You might be all right today.
Yeah, but it'll be good to get there.
It will, yeah.
Breathe out a bit.
A deep sigh, yeah. Jill, well, thanks for joining us. Do you want to just introduce yourself and let everybody know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Dr Gill Anson, and I'm a consultant clinical psychologist with Changing Minds UK. I work in the CAFS team, which is the Child and Family Service. So my work is, historically I've worked in CAMS, in child and adolescent mental health, in paediatrics, and as an expert witness too. And then now my role here is largely actually supporting other organisations to bring a psychological perspective. So although I do some direct work with young people and families, mostly what I do now is I work with other professionals to enhance their psychological knowledge and confidence and thinking around their work.
How did you get into this then? How did you get into this?
Into this work?
Yeah.
I wasn't a good enough dancer, Frank. Frankly.
Well, there's a...
Well, surely I should have been in there then as well.
That's what I wanted to do.
So you really wanted to be a dancer, but then something...
I did. I'm
classical ballet stuff or contemporary or what was that?
Yeah, sort of more. Yeah, I did all sorts, but more modern. I was never going to be a classical ballet.
Yeah.
So more modern stuff. But no, I think I just like throwing shapes on the dance floor. That's the limit I discovered of my talent. But how did I get into it? I think so. My mum was a clinical psychologist and a psychotherapist, so I suppose I was sort of brought up around thinking about things in quite a philosophical and psychological way. And so it sparked my interest. I think I've always been really interested in the human condition, and people and philosophy, I suppose. I ended up at university, I did psychology, but I did politics and philosophy along with it. And I think that was really, I suppose I'm interested in that's why I've then been drawn to a more systemic perspective, is that, humans in groups and how systems work and all those dynamics, whether it be a family or whether it be a whole culture and everything in between. So I then do leadership work within our service. So we work specifically doing training, but also supporting leaders in terms of thinking about all of this stuff too. And I find that really exciting, because if you're having an impact at the top, that helps things to cascade down, doesn't it? So, yeah.
So what I mean, in terms of, you were presenting, I think recently, to a group of head teachers. What sort of things are they raising with you? How, as a barometer, how are things feeling from your side? In terms of the leaders that you meet and how they're feeling about life in general.
Things that stick out. I suppose it's slightly different in different spheres. I think education-wise, personally, I can really see how there's a lot of societal burden.
Yes.
Upon education and schools. We've got a lot of complex issues, haven't we, to do with young people and in society, and post-COVID and the impact of COVID, and that's still a bit of a struggle. I can see that in my household, and I can hear that talking to other people as well, and particularly within education. So I think talking to educators leaders in education, I think they feel a lot of that pressure of the responsibility for so many different issues in society that are complex, that have got, they're so multifactorial, aren't they?
Yes.
And I think they often feel a pressure on them to be responsible for that and to take the lead on that. And of course, whilst they're really well placed because they see those children regularly, they can't do that on their, none of us could do that on our own. They're really complex factors, aren't they, with all sorts of things playing in, from poverty to the impact of that loss of connection during COVID, to employment, etc., etc. There's so many mental health services for adults, even that then has an effect, doesn't it, on children, as well as obviously the more direct facilities.
Yes, it's interesting.
I used to say to teachers that they may not know it, but they had a faulty gene that brought you into teaching, and it was a gene that made you feel responsible for everything that had gone wrong in the world. And so when somebody gets bowled out at cricket and the people say we're not doing enough cricket in schools, every teacher goes, yeah, we're not. It's our faults.
And I wonder how much inadvertently or more directly that's reinforced in society, that idea of, well, you need to be doing more, you need to be doing more.
Interesting. I was in Bradford this week. They real shout out to some of the work they've done after the pandemic and after the opportunity area closed down. But a number of the heads were saying we find ourselves now really concerned about the issues that are happening to the family and what we are doing in order to enable the children to give their best in school, and they were talking about co-location. That actually some of them have found themselves not with a big Bradford council plan, but they found themselves meeting health workers, social workers far more frequently, and actually a keenness to have them co-located. And actually, from somebody who's inspected a number of did some work around sort of 10 inspectorates where we brought them all together, from probation into social care into health. The cultures within those services are quite different. So interestingly, that a number of them were pointing out the fact that they felt that they needed more sort of training and support in how to bring some of these services together co-located. And the training that they have is very focused on outcomes, academic outcomes. And it's interesting, this week I got sight of the Key Stage 1 national figures, which are going to show some improvement, not massive improvement, but some improvement. And I can imagine the government saying, well, look, we've turned the corner, things are going to get better. But actually sitting within that getting better, that there's just a very narrow focus on that. And there's the bigger issues, the more sort of long-term issues that are quite difficult to measure, but actually they're sitting there. And I think head teachers can feel that, and they don't feel equipped to be able to cope with some of those challenges at the moment. So it was interesting, Bradford, this week.
Yeah, when we were doing children's trusts in Lancashire, one of my jobs, roles, projects was to write a leadership framework for all the different organisations, fire, police, health. And so you look at all that, and I mean, they were all based on standards, and none of them really connected with the other. So it was like, right, we'll take the lot, and the health was actually the best one, I think, if I remember rightly. The health was the one that was closest. And eventually I did it all on behaviours. I took away everything and just said, right, well, the thing we can say across all these services is we can look at the way people behave and the way they manage their own behaviour. So that's it was based. But when you say the cultures were different, some of the leadership frameworks were just wildly different, considering that we were all technically in the same role.
I mean, you have a podcast, don't you, Jill, about leadership?
I do. We do. It's called the Evolving Psychologically Responsive Leadership Podcast. And we talk to people from all sorts of backgrounds, actually. Although we largely work with people from health, education and social care, we've got people from all sorts of backgrounds on there, from finance and higher education to the army to wine industry. So that's been really interesting, and hearing what they've got to say. And what you were just saying there was making me also think about what I hear within that podcast and talking to people, but also with educators and leaders in education, is that tension between being task focused in terms of outcomes or whatever it is, and being relational focused. And I think sometimes they feel that there is now more information, and when they're working with other professionals like us, they're trying to shift a bit more towards having a relational focus. But they're perhaps working in a system that's very task focused. And we were discussing this last week. We did a day with leaders, educational leaders across Liverpool, and we were talking about, in some of the conversations we had there, about that tension, but that actually sometimes when we're relationally focused, that can help us get to the task as well. It's just a little bit more of a route off the main drag, as it were. But I think there's lots of benefits to that, which you were alluding to when you were talking about it, in terms of all the other benefits and how we can take children who are, and adults and people and staff who are struggling. Yeah. We can take them with us when we have more of a relational focus. But sometimes, from the top down, that's not what the pressures are.
I think when Frank and I were heads, there was this feeling that you were either an academic school who didn't care much for the children, or you were a very caring school who didn't bother about the academic progress. And I could never get my head around it and say, no, we're both. Children do enjoy coming to our school. They do laugh at times. They do have fun. But we're also getting results that are higher than most of the schools. Yeah. It's not an or, it's an and.
Yeah. I think for me, it was around at the heart of education. I think it was a really disappointing move when the coalition government renamed the Department for Children and Families to the Department for Education. That then became, the focus was purely on education. And what did we mean by education, I think, has been highlighted this week by Keir Starmer when saying this: people outside of education just simply can't understand why we talk about education and skills. And actually a good education involves skills. It's not just about the knowledge, it's about that, it's about the attitudes, it's about what you're able to sort of enable children to aspire to. All of this is all part of a good education. So it's sort of like, it's as if what happened in 2010 was that actually it just became quite narrow. And I think schools like the ones you were describing there, which have been trying to hold on, Stan, to that sense of, a broader view of things, actually have been, 13 years of an onslaught of one agenda item, which they feel very uneasy with, but have had to play the game in order just to keep in the game, And
that again then gets played out, doesn't it? I can see within it's not just education, actually. I think it's all organisations that work with children, but I think it's really, this is just my opinion from what I see, it's really played out in education, that polarising of a behavioural approach and a more sort of, what's called trauma-informed approach. And that gets really split, like they are, they're opposed to one another, and that they're a kind of binary. Whereas actually, I think that, as human beings, of course, we have a threat system, but we're also behavioural beings, and we're shaped by our environment and the response that we get. And actually, we can put both of these things together. We can put other information together as well about what helps us to feel motivated and engage and master things, master our skills, like you're talking about. And we can put all of that information together to draw on the best psychological knowledge we've got, rather than this polarising of, well, we're either behavioural or we're trauma-informed. And if we're trauma-informed, we don't use any consequences, or we don't do anything, and if we're behavioural, we, as you said before, don't think about or don't care almost. And actually that's just a false dichotomy, I think, really.
So, I mean, these chats, Stan, aren't they? They're the best bit of in-service we get each week. Actually, it sort of makes me realize then, I mean, this is over just in terms of behavior. There's certain people on social media who want to promote a very sort of one-sided view. And I think what you've done is managed to convey that this is a much more sort of nuanced and integrated approach that's required. Right, Stan, we've had
Well,
15
fits
minutes.
nicely in, I think, to that.
I know, yeah. What's
conversation.
caught your eye this week?
I just picked up on a tweet where someone had suggested, let's say, that there was no place in schools for a teacher hugging a child. It was completely inappropriate and it should never happen. And it just left me cold when I thought of 4 and 5-year-olds in an environment that they've never met before, and an adult that they're going to make a friend of, just saying, no, we can't hug. And it took me back to being ahead and saying, and I know I said this every time when we had an intake of reception parents, that if a child in this school needs a hug from a teacher, they will get one. If you're not happy with that, if that makes you uncomfortable, you may have chosen the wrong school. That's where we stand. And in 10 years, I never got a parent who said anything other than that's what we want. And I was thinking about it last night and I thought, I can't actually remember myself as head ever hugging any of the children, but it was to say to the staff, you are looking after these children. You're making emotional connections with them all the time. And if you reject a child who's coming for a hug because they feel they need it, I'm sure you're doing more damage than you're doing good. I'm sure of it.
Because kids need, especially young children, you're talking about, primary school children, aren't you? They're often in those situations being stretched and tested, and they're away from their families, especially in reception.
Yeah.
And they're going to need some help to regulate at times, aren't they? And that starts with when we're feeling really stressed and overwhelmed. We need to regulate our bodies first of all, don't we? Well, how do we do that with our children? We do it through safe touch, don't we?
Yeah.
And first and foremost, and words. So it's understandable that that's going to be a natural human connection is to do that. I think people get pulled sometimes by, obviously safeguarding concerns.
Yeah.
And I totally understand that. It's a bit of a golden mean, isn't it? Somebody was using that phrase on our podcast recently. It's the golden meme, and it's the golden mean in everything, isn't it? About not getting too pulled one way, not getting too pulled the other, and sitting somewhere with the nuance, like you said before, Frank.
It's acting professionally and understanding that that's actually part of your profession. Is to be able to know how to behave and how to react and how to respond to children's needs. But it's easy also to write a set of rules for staff to say you don't do that in the classroom on your own. You don't do. And again, I would expect staff acting professionally to make sure that didn't happen, to be sure that they were protecting themselves as much as anything.
And also if it was happening too often.
Yeah.
I mean, and at times when perhaps it wasn't required. These are all indications of something slightly more sort of beyond the normal. And I think those are times when you would perhaps say something, but actually,
I remember my daughter at age 17 hugging the teacher at college when she got her A-level results.
Yeah. And I think I said before, the 4-year-old running up to me as the head, just grabbing my leg and hanging onto the leg. I mean, I don't know how you're supposed to react to that in front of all the parents. What, run away, push them off, whatever. You wouldn't do that, would you?
I'm not sure kicking them off would go down particularly well.
No. But anyway, what's caught your eye this week, Jill?
What caught my eye was I'd seen that apparently 5 schoolgirls had written a letter to Rishi Sunak about how they felt and their arguments for why they wanted single-sex toilets within their school. And I guess what caught my eye here was not necessarily their argument or their point, but was that they felt able to express their opinion, to write to the top as they saw it, to argue their point. And I think I was really impressed with that, and for other people to then counter some of that and have their other arguments put forward. But I suppose I've seen across some schools and education, the higher education, there's been more of a trend to kind of push down some debate sometimes, and actually I love the phrase having a safe space for disagreement. I really like that phrase, to be able to disagree well, to be able to articulate our points without getting into just, you know, slandering people, but actually talking about the subject matter and arguing our points is really important. So I was just really impressed that they had done that, and I suppose it felt hopeful that young people were finding a way of countering perhaps what the trend is, but also engaging positively and openly.
I heard an MP talking about how they actually across the divide, when they work together on various projects, how they get on and they work together, and it's all very convenient. And you just think maybe we need to see some of that, rather than the adversarial approach. The only bit we see is the shouting of abuse at each other across the dispatch box.
Yeah.
Or maybe some stuff where people are sitting down and coming up with something, even though they may have different ideas or different beliefs in the way things should be done, to come together and knock something together that works.
It's like the select committees. Select committees are really effective, where they bring different MPs from different parties together, and they generally, I think it's more than half of the committee reports they produce are actually unanimous. You know, so everybody from whichever party. And there's one this week, isn't there, where I think the Education Select Committee has suggested that the plans for T levels and the loss of BTECs, you know, is really really they ought to be very careful about what the route they're on, because I don't think anybody said that. The committee was saying there's nothing wrong with this T level idea, just that we think there aren't going to be enough businesses able to support them, and we're going to end up by stopping the BTECs and there'll be nothing to fall back to. So they were really sort of suggesting a more measured approach. And that was unanimously agreed, but actually the government have rejected it. The reason why is because it's, you know, they're all for BTECs, and they've decided that they're all for T levels, and the BTECs are going. So we can't make it look as though we made the wrong decision. You know, so it then makes you wonder, well, what's the point of having select committees then? You know, if they're going to produce these reports, that every time the government's just going to ignore it. And that's consistently
a lot of support for cross-party groups being responsible for education, health, so that it wasn't this nonsense that we have at the moment, where, you know, our first plan is to undo whatever the last lot did, and they'll then undo whatever we do, and no long-term plans for anything. There isn't a long-term plan.
No, and it's also making me wonder whether there's something there in the government, for example, in that example, where actually being seen to do a U-turn, being seen to actually we've listened and now we've changed our mind, is seen as weakness in some way rather than good leadership.
It's funny because Michael Wilshaw, we've said this before.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing, Frank.
He changed his mind about Ofsted reports having single grades. He was a big fan of those when I worked with him, and he was the one that said, well, we've got to get rid of satisfactory, we've got to have good, every school's got to be good. And there was a lot of pushback on this within the organisation. And I remember being in meetings with him and with senior civil servants saying, don't know if we've got the legislation for this, but whatever. So, but he drove that very hard. And recently he's now U-turned. And his line was, you know, well, actually, I know a bit more. Things are not the same. You know, and actually, I think it's just a level of maturity. And no one's castigated him for changing his mind. There's no, you know, I mean, it just happens, doesn't it? You know, things move on.
And the problem is, like you were saying before, Stan, because you've got like an adversarial system at times, that anything that does happen with the U-turn or a change of mind just gets used across those dispatch boxes in such a, I mean, it's embarrassing to watch at times, isn't it? Where actually that makes it more hard, and when people do that, to then that's good leadership.
Yeah.
To say, actually, I've learned more, I've changed my mind, I've reflected on something.
Yeah.
You know,
I think the adversarial bit was highlighted, as you said, Stan, on Question Time last night, which is the most disgraceful bit of macho, ill-informed, aggressive behaviour I have seen. And I've seen, and I don't watch it, to be honest, very often, but last night was absolutely awful. If young people are watching that and thinking, this is what you have to do to be an MP, this is what the government's about. Whoa, dear me, this is a really poor place we're in.
Bad manners.
Yeah, terrible.
Just I can remember when I first started teaching, and teachers would say to me, well, we need to teach the children manners, and I thought, this is just rubbish. And actually, good manners are really important, and help in leadership. If you've been brought up to respect other people's viewpoints and to listen and to know that you have a different viewpoint, but you need to listen and hear, and that's part of having good manners when you're 4 and 5, listening.
The worst thing for me,
a Brian Clough quote recently, who said, how did you cope when players disagreed with your ways of playing? And he said, well, we'd meet up, we'd have a 20-minute meeting. They'd say their point of view, I'd say my point of view, and at the end of it, they'd realise I was right all along.
Right. Well, what's caught my eye this week is that I'm sort of just changing it a bit, I suppose. I'm not going to sort of cover the thing that I thought of initially. I think we haven't spoken a lot about strikes. Strikes are on today. There's a national teacher strike going on. And that's a matter that's not been resolved for months and months and months. And it's talk about post-pandemic recovery. I mean, this is a self-inflicted wound, isn't it, on lots of children, because in a way there's been in my view, a lack of engagement, between government and employers and the unions. But also there was, we still have a situation at the moment where schools cannot set their school budgets. We're 2 weeks away from the end of term, and every single school is uncertain about what their budget situation is like, because the Secretary of State has not released the recommendation paper for teachers' pay awards. And actually, that means to say that no school in this country knows what the budget situation is like going forward.
Whether it will be funded or...
They have no idea what that figure is. And I know the trust, I'm involved in a trust in East Manchester. We've had to set up a series of scenarios to move forward. It's a colossal amount of work for that finance team, simply because there's something in there that's politically unacceptable. Because if it was great news, it would be out, wouldn't it? But what the government has done every time is they've left it to virtually the day after the schools close. We talk about workload and well-being. This is a conscious decision that this government's making not to release that information, not to release that report. And it's actually just adding incredible uncertainty to a very fragile situation at the moment. So, all of these things are, really sort of central to how much confidence you have that the government are actually pulling for you and for the children that you serve. And I feel they fall short at the moment. And last night's Question Time, I have to go back to it, Stan. The MP, the Tory minister, did this when he was told, let somebody else in.
It's just...
You think, what is that?
Childish.
My only thing is that I'm pleased that most primary school children are in bed by the time that's on, and aren't really allowed to be on social media. We're not supposed to be, but
Well, the advice from one of the ministers to say, why can't teachers, if they want to go on strike during the holidays?
I know. And I retweeted, they should go on strike when they're asleep.
Yeah. Just wow.
Oh, anyway, well, I mean, we've been doing this since May 2020, every week, apart from the summer holidays where we have a 4-week break. And I think this government has been so successful in keeping this Frankenstein chat going, that we ought to offer a vote of thanks to the sort of issues that have arisen during that time, from in effect the first lockdown to now, and they just continue to, to surprise us.
I'm really interested in, you were saying that they're not releasing that information about what you think the factors are and why they're not doing that.
I think it's bad news, and they're not funding it. They're not going to fund all of it.
Right.
And they think that the government, looking at the budgets, if you take all the budgets in every single school, including the reserves, which I think is what they've done, they think there's enough money in the system for the system to deliver that. But unfortunately, the cake is split up into individual slices for individual schools. And that will mean that some schools and some trusts will be able to cope with a 6.5% unfunded, but they might be able to do it for a year. They won't be able to do it forever. But there are others that will go to the wall. But so their argument will be there's enough money in the system.
Yeah,
but they've created a funding formula that's meant that some of the schools won't have enough.
And so it'll be redundancies amongst teaching assistants will be the first, and there'll be a hierarchy of who we lose first in order to pay what we have to pay for.
And that's in a context, isn't it, of what we were saying before, whereby schools are also expected and best placed to do all this kind of social workery, connection and think about all those other things as well, isn't it? So there may be money there in some view, but actually we're trying to do all sorts of different things with that money that society's asking us to do.
And if education is education, we've still got the Department of Education. That's a very narrow sort of view of what schools are doing, and particularly those serving the most challenging communities.
It's when the government announced things like we're going to put a mental health expert in every school, which means another teacher is going to be told to go on some training and then you will be our mental health expert. There's no money to come with that. There's no extra, just more work for those who are willing to do.
Can we end up with something positive this week? I mean, Gill, we often ask our guests, I don't know if you've thought about this, is there something you'd like to do to change sort of the lives of children and young people moving forward?
Blimey. Oh gosh, so many things. I think what I said before probably is, if we could, I suppose it goes across everything we've talked about in lots of ways, if we could realise the power of connection and how much that can really shape our experience, our human experience. And it doesn't have to be a connection rather than task or rather than, performance. It doesn't have to be. That actually good connection, when you look at all the research in terms of resilience in children, despite the fact that they've had lots of adversity, it's relationships is one of the most key factors, because it's that connection that helps us to feel more safe, more secure, scaffolds our learning, scaffolds our ability to risk take, to feel good about ourselves. So I suppose finding a way at different levels of the system for really understanding the power of connection, and that you don't have to lose the other objectives whilst we're doing that. I think that's really important. And I suppose that's a lot of what we do in our work, isn't it? When that's what we're trying to do, really. Yeah.
Brilliant. Wow. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure. Stan, that car's ready to head off to North Wales. The engine's running.
Thanks for sticking with us till the end, Stan.
Yeah.
I was more. We've been looking after our 1-year-old grandson all week and overnight at weekend. So I'm more likely to fall asleep than jump and leap.
Anyway, all being well, I think we have got one final Frankenstein chat before we close down for the summer. And one thing also, this week we've recorded the first of the new Frankenstein spotlights with Dennis Sherwood, and I'll be posting that up next week as well. We're looking at how reliable are exam grades that are being given, and the book he's written about, is it called Missing the Mark? So that'll be up next week as well. So thanks, Jill, and
Thanks very much.
Nice to meet you both.
everybody have a great week, and hopefully we'll see you all next week. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.